Let's bring in a social security expert from Wits School of Governance, Professor Alex Van Den Heever. He joins us now via video link just to weigh in on a range of issues related to security concerns. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. I mean, one of the things that we have come to appreciate about these hijacked buildings is that whilst they afford much needed accommodation to those who desperately need it, in the main, though, the buildings are a crime den and they are not safe to live in. I mean, is this too big a job for municipalities and law enforcement authorities to deal with hijacked buildings?
No, I don't think it is, but I think it is the requirement of certainly metros, which have highly concentrated populations under their jurisdiction, to manage basically the whole physical environment of the city. Now, in these cases, the issue of housing is one particular area. The other is of hijacked buildings and the illegal occupation of buildings and the non-compliance with bylaws, etc. All of those things need to be managed by the city. They have the capability, they have the finances to deal with them. They also have the time to deal with them. And when you see problems that you see in the center of Johannesburg as well as in eThekwini, is basically the result of a long-term neglect of a whole range of policy areas that are resulting in basically the collapse of your CBD areas. And that is devastating for cities.
And I mean, it is interesting to hear you say that, Prof, particularly after hearing what the Auditor General had to say in as far as some of these metros are concerned. I mean, when we look at collaboration, just to fix this particular problem, when we look at the various role players, should the private sector not also play a bigger role here at somehow, given the fact that some of these buildings, we are told, have been abandoned by private owners? I mean, these raids, of course, like I said, come as we make sense of the latest Auditor General's report that speaks to dysfunctional municipalities, financial mismanagement, crumbling municipal infrastructure. So it does become very hard to see how they alone can do this.
So here's the problem, is that private sector can only engage if you've got a competent public sector to work with. So the central problem that the Auditor General is picking up is the fact that many of these municipalities are deeply corrupt and mismanaged, have very, very poor leadership at the top, largely a political problem that has resulted from many years of non-accountability. So you see the reversal in many municipalities, and that is actually a failure really to hold political leadership to account for the running of these cities. So the problem really is the quality of your leadership overall. If you've got that quality, you can bring together many different stakeholders to solve complex problems. But if you've got very, very weak political leadership and very, very weak administrations as a consequence of that, then basically all solutions don't work. It ceases to be a technical problem. Basically, you just have a complete absence of leadership. For us to have one metro that has a clean record is unacceptable. Metros have a substantial amount of revenue and theoretically capability. It is unacceptable that they are unable to essentially have unqualified audits, clean audits. And that is an indication of serious leadership problems overall. And the outcomes are what we're seeing with hijacked buildings. Also important to note that many public buildings are hijacked. So in the case of Johannesburg, they're owned by Johannesburg, but they're owned by the city and they're owned by the provincial administration. And so this is where the government actually fails to do its job.
And yet, just speaking about Johannesburg, we still have, similar conditions. We are nowhere near, building and fixing some of those buildings, particularly when you think about Marshalltown and the whole fires that continue to gut some of these buildings because they are unsafe. But just talking about your point that you raised earlier about corruption. I mean, during the raids this afternoon, the KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner, Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi, revealed that some of police officers have actually been arrested and others dismissed for their involvement in working with some of these illegal immigrants to commit crimes at these hijacked buildings. We know, of course, that there's also been some kind of implication from the city's perspective in terms of officials also being involved here. This, of course, from the police side has to be commended in terms of the arrests and the dismissals. But how wide scale do you think this problem is likely to be?
I think it is very widespread. But part of the problem is that, I can get into my car and drive into the Joburg CBD, and I will be able to identify hijacked buildings just from my car. So you tell me that provincial and local government authorities and the police can't identify them, can't identify the sources of potential criminality? They can. So it really takes the will to do it and to get on with the job. There are laws that can be enforced. There are strategies that can be implemented. So in many cases where people are in need of accommodation and alternative accommodations, you have to basically have a strategy around being able to move people to decent places where they can stay, rather than leaving them in these hijacked buildings. And then if you want to repurpose those buildings, there are many strategies to deal with that. So what I am happy that in eThekwini they've begun the process. But actually it's relatively straightforward, and you know that there is deep criminality. You just have to lift the rock and you will find it. So basically people have to get on with it and act.
And I mean, when you look at Joburg, the city of Johannesburg, of course, they've also been accused of just taking their time. But where should they begin now? Because it has been a couple of years. We are presumably sitting in the government of national unity, big changes being promised, the social contract also that needs to be honored by government between its citizens and itself. Where do they start? Where's the starting point?
Yeah, so firstly, at the Joburg level and at the Gauteng level, there is no government of national unity. There are coalition structures that are in place, but they're largely there to maintain the status quo. The requirement going forward has to deal with some complex problems, which means that if you've got to find an alternative accommodation for key people, you have to look at being able to legally evict and move people, and you have to directly address the criminality. So it's a combined effort. What you're seeing in Johannesburg is no action whatsoever on any front. And this is problematic because it does become a deeper and more complex problem the longer you leave it. So you've got to basically get on top of it. In some cases, the problems have really emerged over the last 5 years and have just got worse and worse. The bribery and corruption that occurs at the point of these buildings, as well as the sort of syndicates operating around them, are pretty easy to penetrate if you have proper task forces to deal with them. So the strategies followed in the Cape Metro involved preparing alternative decent accommodation, preparing and going to the courts to ensure that they've got proper legally binding, eviction orders, and moving people appropriately. It's important that you don't abandon people on the streets. You have to have a proper social housing strategy. We don't see it in Johannesburg or at the provincial level. We don't really have strategies to deal with the huge inward migration of populations. So you're going to find eThekwini, Johannesburg and Cape Town receive large populations, large inward population movements from other provinces. This is going to be only settle in the next 15 years or so. So we've got to be able to deal with this change proactively, not retrospectively, and not in a sort of a knee-jerk response. These are long-term issues. They require properly considered strategies that are developed, properly financed, implemented with high-quality task teams behind them. We don't see any of that in Johannesburg. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of it in eThekwini.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. Let's leave it there for now. Of course, Professor Alex Van Den Heever, social security expert from the Wits School of Governance for us.